The handcuffs bit into her wrists against the hood of the cruiser, and the officer leaning over her shoulder laughed, like it was the funniest thing he'd seen all week. "Nobody in this town is coming to save you," he said, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. He pressed her harder into the hot metal and waited for her to beg. She didn't, because the small silver pendant resting against her collarbone, the one he'd looked right at and dismissed, had been transmitting everything to federal headquarters for the past 11 minutes. Every word, every threat, every illegal move. He had no idea what was coming, and neither did she expect it to get this bad. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that like button. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's get into it. Mara Voss had a system for new towns. She'd drive and slow pick up a coffee from wherever looked least like a chain and spend 20 minutes in the parking lot before she went anywhere near the hospital. Not because she was nervous. It had mostly left her after her second deployment, but because she needed the town to settle around her before she moved through it. Place had a rhythm. Knowing it before you needed, it was the difference between a clean exit and a problem. Harlow County, Georgia sat at the kind of intersection that didn't show up in most travel coverage. It was the spot where two state highways crossed each other without ceremony, where the Dollar General had been there longer than the school, and where the water tower still had the name of a football team painted on it from 1987. The kind of place that had decided it was finished with change sometime around the Clinton administration, and had spent the years since quietly resenting everything that kept arriving anyway. Had been through 11 towns like it in the past 3 years. They'd all had the same feeling, not hostile exactly. More like a body that had stopped trusting anything that came through the front door. She understood that feeling better than most. Her sister Elise was in the passenger seat, asleep against the window, with her cheek creasing against the seatbelt, which she'd somehow managed to use as a pillow without unbuckling it. That was Elise always finding a solution to something that wasn't actually a problem. Mara had been driving since Knoxville. It was just past noon, and the sun was doing what Georgia sun does in August, which is behave like a personal grievance aimed directly at the top of your head. They were going to see their mother, Nadine Voss, had finished her 4th round of chemotherapy 2 weeks earlier, and the doctor's latest report had been cautious in the way doctors get when they're trying not to say something's working too well because they don't want to be wrong about it. She was at home now in the house where Mara and Elise had grown up in the town of Crestfield, 60 miles south of where they currently were. Elise had booked 2 days off. Mara had arranged her traveling nurse rotation specifically around the visit, telling the placement agency she needed a gap week without explaining more than that. She didn't explain things more than necessary. That was also a system. The low fuel indicator had been blinking since the Harlow County line, because Mara had told herself she'd stopped before the county and then gotten absorbed in something Elise said about a case she was working, and now here they were. She pulled off the highway at the first exit with a gas station sign. The Fulton Road Shell was the kind of station that peaked sometime in the 1990s. Islands of pumps, a flickering overhead canopy, a small convenience store with hand-painted window lettering advertising fishing bait and lottery tickets. Pickup truck sat on the far side of the lot, engine off, no one in it. Felt half asleep. Mara pulled up to the nearest pump and cut the engine. Startled awake the way she always did, not gradually, but all at once like a phone ringing. "Are we there?" "We're at a gas station. That's not what I asked." "No, we're not there. We need gas." Mara opened the door and stepped out into the heat, which landed on her like a flat hand. Anything inside. Elise was already stretching arms above her head, making a sound that would have embarrassed her in court. Water. And those little powdered donuts, if they have them. I always have them. "That's why I asked." Mara swiped her card at the pump, punched in the zip code, and pulled the nozzle. Up and started. She leaned against the side of the SUV and looked at the highway beyond the canopy. It out here had a particular flatness to it in the afternoon. Everything too bright and too still, like a photograph of a place rather than the place itself. She'd been feeling something low and persistent in her chest since they crossed the county line. She'd learned not to dismiss that feeling. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like the part of her brain that had been trained to read environments doing its job, filing something it hadn't fully articulated yet. She was still thinking about it when the cruiser turned into the lot. Harlow County Sheriff's Department ran 3 shifts with 6 patrol officers per shift, which was a lot of officers for a county that size. Mara knew this, because she'd done background reading on the counties she'd be passing through. She did this before every leg of a trip-old habit one she'd developed during her second FBI posting and never fully shook. A cruiser that pulled into the Fulton Road shell was black and white, current model, no visible damage. It rolled past the pump, stopping, and circled the lot once. Aya watched it without appearing to watch it. She kept her posture loose, her eyes on the highway. The cruiser stopped 20 feet away. A second cruiser appeared at the lot entrance. Then a third pulled in behind Mara's SUV and parked close enough that she'd have had to ask them to move if she wanted to back out. She felt the low feeling in her chest sharpen into something more specific. Lee stepped out of the passenger side, bottle of water in hand, looking at the cruisers with an expression that was mostly confusion and not yet worry. There. Stay calm, Mara said quietly enough that only her sister heard it. Don't raise your voice. The lead officer got out of the first cruiser. He was tall, mid-40s, with a jaw that looked like it had been designed to express skepticism and a uniform that was pressed in a way that required actual effort. His nameplate read Brat. He walked toward Mara with the kind of pace that's designed to make you feel like you should already be apologizing. Two more officers climbed out behind him, a younger one heavyset whose nameplate read Fenwick, and a third who stayed closer to the back cruiser, one hand resting on his belt, watching. Afternoon. Braddock said he looked at the SUV. He looked at Mara. He looked at the SUV again. Afternoon, Mara said. Your vehicle. Yes, you got registration on it? Compartment. She made no move toward the car. I can get it if you'd like. Braddock tilted his head at Fenwick, who stepped around Mara and opened the passenger door without asking. Elise took a small step back, reflexive. Hey, Elise said. Stay where you are. Oswick said, without looking at her. Becca kept her eyes on Braddock. Can you tell me what this is about? Teen check, he said. We had a report of a vehicle matching this description, stolen out of Macon this morning. This vehicle hasn't been near Macon, Mara said. We drove down from Knoxville. Right. It wasn't a question, he said it. The way people say things they've already decided they don't believe. Fenwick leaned into the passenger side, opened the glove compartment, and started going through it. He pulled out the registration, looked at it, Braddock. Tyson said nothing. Registration matches. Mara said it's current. I'll verify that, Braddock said. I'll wait. He looked at her then. Really looked at her the way people look when they're deciding if you're going to be a problem or a person who accepts that they're not going to be treated like a person. Nadia had been on the receiving end of that look enough times to recognize it. Gazed and kept her face still. Get your ID, he said. It. Elise got hers. Braddock took both without a word and walked back to his cruiser. Remained, leaning against Mara's SUV like it belonged to him. A third officer, the one whose plate Mara hadn't been able to read yet, had drifted to the far side of the vehicle and was looking through the rear window. Elise moved close to Mara and lowered her voice. They can't just look through the car like that. No, Mara said, they can't. Are you going to say something? Not yet. The pump handle kicked with the click of a full tank. Replaced the nozzle in its holster without rushing. The sun pressed down on the canopy above them. Inside the convenience store, someone had turned on a television, and a news segment drifted out through the propped-open door. Braddock came back. Says here you live in Knoxville, he said, looking at Mara's license. I do. What's your business in Harlow County passing through? We're visiting our mother in Crestfield. He handed the license back without looking at her. Then he looked at the SUV. We're going to need you to step away from the vehicle while we complete a search. His jaw tightened once, almost imperceptibly. On what grounds? Braddock's expression didn't change. Suspicion of narcotics possession. Based on the officer's discretion. He tilted his chin toward Fenwick. Step away from the vehicle, please. Elise made a sound beside her. Not quite a protest. Not quite a question, something in between, that Mara recognized as the sound her sister made when she was deciding whether to let herself be angry. Mara said once quietly. They stepped away from the vehicle. Next lasted 40 minutes, though it didn't feel like time was moving forward in any normal sense. It felt more like the officers were doing something to time, compressing it and stretching it in ways that left Mara standing on the oil-stained concrete, wondering how it was still only 12:48 in the afternoon. Fenwick and the third officer, his plate read Doss, went through the SUV methodically, but not the way trained officers conduct a proper search. They went through it the way people go through something when they want you to watch them doing it. They dumped the duffel bags from the back onto the pavement. Opened Elise's tote bag and pulled things out one at a time, turning each item over and setting it down too hard. A paperback. A charger, a get-well card Elise had made for their mother. The envelope still sealed the handwriting on the front in Elise's careful printed letters. Mike picked up the envelope, looked at it, then let it drop. Elise's breath caught. Mara watched. She had shifted her position so she could see all three officers without turning her head. Hands were at her sides. The silver pendant rested against her sternum, warm from her skin and from the heat. She'd activated the transmitter 9 minutes ago. She'd done it without breaking stride, without changing her expression, pressing the small recessed tab on the pendant's reverse face with her thumbnail in a motion that looked like nothing, like someone brushing dust off their collarbone. The device was a SecureLink T7 Bureau-issued, modified for undercover field use. Once activated, it transmitted audio and biometric data on a 30-second relay to a designated receiving station. Battery life was 6 hours. She had not activated it because she expected to need rescue. She had activated it because what was happening on this pavement was exactly what she had spent 14 months documenting from the inside out. And she was not going to let a single word of it disappear into the way these officers would later describe it in their reports. "You girls traveling alone?" Braddock asked. He'd come back from his cruiser and was standing a few feet off her right shoulder. "Yes," Mara said, "long drive from Knoxville. It's not that long. Fuck, you work." "I'm a traveling nurse." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Us. Huh." He looked at the pendant. "What's that?" "It was my grandmother's," Mara said. "It's just silver." He looked at it for another second, then looked at the SUV. "Your sister work in medicine too," Elise answered before Mara could. "I'm in law." Braddock looked at her. Something moved across his face, brief and controlled. "Kind of law, federal," Elise said. There was a pause that lasted about 2 seconds longer than pauses usually do. "Well," Braddock said, and his voice had shifted slightly, something tighter underneath it now. "That doesn't really change anything we're doing here." I know it doesn't," Elise said. "I just thought you'd want to know who you're searching." It was the right thing to say, and also possibly the wrong time to say it. Mara could feel the temperature of the situation move. Braddock looked at Doss, who looked at Fenwick. Nothing was said aloud, but something moved between the three of them. Braddock pulled the last bag from the SUV and set it on the pavement. "Nothing," he said. Braddock said, "Check it again." "There's nothing in there, Sarge. Check it again." Checked it again. There was still nothing. Braddock turned back to Mara and Elise. "We're going to need you to wait here while we run some additional checks." Russell looked at him steadily. "How long? As long as it takes. Could we have somewhere to be?" "And we have a job to do," he said. Pleasant enough in his tone, unpleasant in everything beneath it. "Don't you too? Come wait over here away from the pumps." He walked them to the space beside his cruiser, the back quarter near the rear wheel well, in the shade of the canopy, but against the vehicle, which meant boxed in from 3 sides. And noted this. She stood so that her back was not against the cruiser door. Elise was quiet now. She'd gone to the quiet she got when she was processing, not shutting down, but compressing. She stood with her arms at her sides and her chin slightly up, which was the thing she did when she refused to let anyone see her adjust. Time moved in its compressed way. A truck pulled into the lot, saw the cruisers, and left. The television inside the store went to a commercial. Us photographed the interior of the SUV with his phone. Sat in the first cruiser on his radio or his phone, Mara couldn't tell. 26 minutes after she'd activated the transmitter, Braddock came back with his expression settled into something final. "We're going to need you to turn around and place your hands on the vehicle." His voice came out before she could stop it. "Excuse me?" "It's a precautionary measure. On what grounds?" Elise said. Her voice was controlled, but the edge in it had gotten through. "You searched the vehicle. You found nothing. You ran our IDs." "Grounds?" "Ma'am, I need you to comply. I'm a federal minus. I need you to comply right now, or I will add a resisting charge." The silence that followed lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Ice looked at Mara. Mara looked back at her, and the look said, "Not yet." Ice turned around. They both put their hands on the cruiser. The metal of the hood was hot enough from the sun that it took real effort not to pull back from it. Placed her palms flat and felt the heat move through them. Quick appeared at her right. He put the cuffs on her wrists without unnecessary roughness, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been rough, the practiced indifference of someone who'd done this too many times for it to register as anything. "It's his unlawful detention," Elise said quietly. As to the pavement in front of her. "Of a complaint." Braddock said. Mara said nothing. She stood against the hot metal of the cruiser with the sun on the back of her neck, and her hands bound behind her, and the pendant lying flat against her chest, transmitting everything. And she thought about what her first commanding officer in the army had told her once on a forward operating base outside Kandahar, when she'd wanted to act 3 days before she should have. Right. You don't move until the moment is right, not 1 second before. Life. She'd waited then, she'd wait now. She was very good at waiting. Life. The thing about Mara Voss was that she hadn't planned any of this, the way the outcome would later make it look like she had. Life. She hadn't chosen to become a combat medic so that she could become an FBI agent. Life. She'd chosen it because at 19, the choice had felt like the only one that made sense. She was the kid in the family who couldn't sit still, who got jittery during slow periods and sharp during emergencies, who'd once reset her brother's dislocated shoulder at a middle school baseball game while their parents were still running across the field. Army gave that particular quality of mind a structure and a use. She served 2 tours, the second one in a role that no longer appeared in her official personnel file, which is its own kind of story. Later, when she came home, she went to nursing school because it was the closest available civilian analog to what she'd been doing, and she was good at it in the specific way that mattered, not gentle, not warm in the performative way some people expected, but fully present, utterly calm. The kind of nurse that trauma patients instinctively trusted because she didn't treat the emergency like a thing that was happening to her. The FBI recruiter had found her 18 months into her first hospital posting. The conversation had taken 40 minutes. She'd said yes by the end of it, and she still wasn't entirely sure she'd made a conscious decision as opposed to recognizing something that had been true for a while. The task force, she'd been specialized in law enforcement corruption in rural jurisdictions. The places where oversight was thin, where the local courthouse had the same last names on the walls for 50 years, where the county sheriff and the county prosecutor might have been fishing buddies since they were 12, the dramatic corruption that made the news. The grinding institutional kind that happened when people in uniform decided that the badge made them exempt from the same rules they were supposed to uphold. Harlow County had been a secondary focus of the task force for 14 months. The primary case file ran 400 pages. Braddock, whose full name was Sergeant Dale Braddock, appeared in it on 17 separate occasions, to complaints that ranged from unlawful stops to evidence fabrication to an incident in 2021 where a man from out of county had spent 11 days in a holding cell on a charge that was later found to have no basis in actual law. None of those complaints had resulted in a single sustained action against Braddock or any officer in his department. This was the thing that had kept Mara up at more than a few nights in the various rented rooms and short-term apartments. Her nursing rotation moved her through the individual bad acts. She understood individual bad acts. They were solvable, but the infrastructure of silence around them. A system of people and relationships and unspoken agreements could absorb complaint after complaint and convert them all into paperwork that went nowhere. She was 3 weeks from the end of her current rotation in this region. The task force was building toward a federal submission. She had not expected Harlow County to come to her at a gas station on a Saturday afternoon, but here they were. She was standing handcuffed against the cruiser, the sun now past the canopy's edge and hitting her directly, thinking about heat management and maintaining physical calm when Doss appeared at her left and put his hand on her shoulder. "We're going to check your vehicle one more time," he said. "You've searched it twice, and now it'll be 3 times." He wasn't aggressive about it. He said it like it was just the most natural thing in the world, like he was explaining a routine to a child. This was Mara had come to understand the worst version of it. The bored version. The version where it wasn't personal, it wasn't power, it was just habit. The habit of treating certain people a certain way because no one had ever made it stop. Went through the car again. He took longer this time, not because he was searching more carefully, but because he was taking his time. He put things down slowly, he opened compartments and left them open. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, with the door wide and 1 foot on the pavement, going through the door pocket, and Mara watched him handle her things and kept her breathing at rate. Then he found the envelope in the backseat pocket. Elise's Get Well card that was still on the pavement where he'd dropped it earlier. Something else, a padded mailer that Mara had received at her current rotation address and had meant to open before the drive. She'd forgotten it was back there. Fenwick turned it over. He looked at the return address. He looked at Braddock. "There's a sealed envelope back here," he said. "Open it," Braddock said. Mara said, and something in her voice shifted for the first time. Since the cruisers had arrived, not louder, not harder, but suddenly very precise. "Sealed mail. You don't have legal grounds to open it." Braddock turned. The look he gave her was the kind that was meant to end things. "You don't," Mara said. "You have run our IDs. You have searched the vehicle twice and found nothing. Have no warrant and no probable cause that survives a 30-second legal review. She held his gaze. Right. If that envelope gets opened, every single thing that's happened in this parking lot is going into a federal filing. Every minute of it. The word federal landed. She watched it land. Braddock's expression didn't crack, but something in the set of his jaw shifted in a way she recognized. He was recalibrating, deciding how to move, whether she was a genuine threat or just a woman who had heard enough legal language from her sister to sound convincing. He decided wrong. Fenwick, he said. Put it down. Fenwick, put it down. Then Braddock walked to where Mara stood against the cruiser. He came closer than he needed to, and lowered his voice in a way that was meant to make feel private, felt only between them. I don't know what you think is happening here, he said. But in this county, people who make trouble for themselves find that trouble has a way of sitting on their record a real long time. He looked at the pendant against her chest. I don't care what your sister does. I don't care where you work. I care that this search gets completed properly, and you two don't leave this parking lot until I say so. He stepped back, and Mara Voss, who had held her hand for 31 minutes, in the burning heat of a Georgia afternoon, looked at Dale Braddock and made the decision that the moment had arrived. Sergeant, she said. He stopped walking. Take the cuffs off. He turned back to her slowly, and the expression on his face was one she knew she would remember for a long time, not anger, not contempt. The absolute certainty of a man who believed he existed in a world where this kind of sentence did not get said to him by someone in her position. He said. Mara looked at him directly. She did not look away. The people already listening, take them off for you. The stillness that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Take them. Fenwick had stopped moving near the SUV. Voss had gone still near the rear bumper. Braddock's face was doing something complicated that moved through several expressions without quite landing on any of them. People, he said. Mara felt the heat on the back of her neck, and the cuffs on her wrists and the pendant again, and she said clearly, and without particular drama, Special Agent Mara Voss, FBI Organized Corruption Task Force. I've been assigned to this region for 14 months. This encounter has been transmitted in real time to a federal response team since 12 minutes after you pulled into this lot. The silence was total. Even the traffic on the highway seemed to stop, though she knew it hadn't. Braddock's face had gone to a color that wasn't quite white, but was moving in that direction. His hand moved toward his radio, automatic, the gesture of someone reaching for control. I wouldn't, Mara said. Whatever you're thinking about saying to your dispatcher right now, they can hear it too. Braddock stopped. And then Elise spoke, from where she was still standing, bound, against the other side of the cruiser. I should probably tell you, Elise said, her voice perfectly, even in the way that meant she had been holding it at exactly that register for a very long time, that I'm not just a federal attorney. I've been assigned as the coordinating prosecutor for the task force investigation into this department for the past 8 months. She paused. So the complaint I filed today is going to land somewhere. You've never had to worry about anything landing before. Braddock's hand was still in the air near his radio. He didn't touch it in the far distance, past the gas station canopy, past the highway that ran east out of Harlow County. Mara heard something she had been listening for since she'd pressed the transmitter tab, the sound of engines. Then one. Moving fast, Braddock heard it too. His face, for the first time in the 43 minutes she had been standing in this parking lot, lost its certainty completely. The engines got louder before anyone moved. Braddock stood with his hand still raised near his radio, not touching it, his face working through something that hadn't reached his body yet. The sound was coming from the east, from the highway, from the direction of the county line. And it was the kind sound that carries a particular meaning when you've spent enough time around federal operations. Not sirens. No lights, just engines pushed hard and the specific low frequency of heavy vehicles moving with purpose. Fenwick heard it too. He'd come out from the SUV and was standing near the rear bumper with his hand on his belt in a posture that wasn't quite ready for anything, but was no longer relaxed. Voss had moved to the side, positioning himself without seeming to the way people do when they feel something closing in and don't want to admit it's closing. Kept her eyes on Braddock. She had expected the arrival to feel like something dramatic, like a switch being thrown, like a scene inverting. But what she felt instead, standing in the heat with her wrists cuffed behind her, was something more like a long exhale. The way you breathe out when you've been holding something for a long time, and the moment finally permits you to stop. 3 black SUVs came off the highway exit at a speed that wouldn't have been legal in a school zone and crossed the lot entrance without slowing enough to be polite about it. They fanned out across the gas station lot in a formation that was completely deliberate, one blocking the exit, one parallel to Braddock's cruiser, one stopping 20 feet back with a clear sight line to every officer on the pavement. Opened. 7 agents stepped out, and Mara recognized 4 of them. The one who came directly toward her was a broad-shouldered woman in her late 40s named Special Agent Lorraine Taft, who ran the regional response arm of the task force, and who had the particular quality of moving through a crisis like it was mildly inconvenient. She wore no expression that could be read as either satisfied or alarmed. She walked to Mara, reached into her jacket, produced a small key, and removed the handcuffs without ceremony. Said. Fine, Mara said. How long? 43 minutes. Taft absorbed this. She handed the cuffs to the agent behind her, turned to look at Braddock, and for a moment said nothing at all. Just looked at him the way someone looks at a problem they've been meaning to deal with and have finally gotten around to. Sergeant Braddock, she said. I'm Special Agent Lorraine Taft, FBI Organized Corruption Task Force. You are currently the subject of a federal investigation into civil rights violations, unlawful detention, and abuse of law enforcement authority. You and your officers are going to surrender your sidearms and department-issued equipment, and you are going to do it right now. Braddock said. You can call whoever you want from a federal holding facility, Taft said. Now, you're going to do what I just told you. Fenwick looked at Braddock. Braddock looked at the ground, then at the agents surrounding him, then at the body cameras on 3 of their vests, then at the recording equipment one of the agents had set up on the hood of the nearest SUV. He was doing math, and the math was not coming out in his favor. He unbuckled his sidearm and held it out. Fenwick did the same, slower, with the particular quality of someone who is hoping this is a mistake that will become clear soon. Voss, at the rear of the lot, removed his weapon without being asked twice. The cuffs went on all 3 of them in a sequence that took less than 4 minutes total. Elise was standing a few feet away, rubbing her wrists, watching. An agent had already approached her. Introduced himself. And was taking her statement in a low, professional voice. She answered his questions precisely and without emotion, which was the thing Elise did when she was managing something she would feel later. Voss stood by Taft's vehicle and watched Braddock walk to the rear of a federal SUV. He didn't look back. She noticed that the ones who didn't look back were usually the ones who knew exactly what was behind them. The debrief happened in stages and in different locations, which was how task force operations worked when the situation had escalated in the field. The first stage was at the gas station, where the scene was documented, photographs, measurements, audio from the transmitter extracted and logged, statements taken from the convenience store clerk, who had watched most of it from behind the lottery ticket rack, and who, when asked what she'd seen, said more than I probably should have had to see on a Saturday. Mara gave her initial account to Taft, while sitting on the rear bumper of the task force's middle SUV with a bottle particularly want, but was drinking because hydration, after heat stresses, is the kind of thing you skip, just because the crisis is technically over. The adrenaline had been burning off for about 20 minutes by then, replaced by the particular flatness that came after long sustained tension, and she was aware that she was tired in a way that had been accumulating for longer than just this afternoon. Taft listened without interrupting. She was good at that, the kind of listener who wasn't composing her response while you talked, who actually waited until you were finished. Envelope, Mara said. He ordered Fenwick to open it. I've heard, Taft said. That's the moment it moved from bad stop to a federal charge tier. It's one of several moments, Taft said. The initial cuffing without cause is already the top of the list. She looked at her tablet. Audio quality from the T7 was clean. We have everything from minute 11 on. I activated at minute 9. Taft paused. Then we have everything from 9. Looked at the cruiser still parked at the lot entrance. One of the agents was photographing it, methodical, moving around the exterior. How much of the case file does this change, she asked. Taft thought about this honestly, which Mara appreciated. Accelerates the timeline, she said. What you have from today, the detention, the illegal search warrants, the Mayville, that's federal criminal exposure on top of the civil rights violations we were already building. It doesn't change what we have on the department. It just gives us a clean, documented, fully corroborated event that's impossible to administrative procedure its way into nothing. Been doing this for years, Mara said. How many complaints were filed? Taft looked at her. 31. Going back to 2018, sustained action 0. The number sat in the air between them for a moment. Drank some of the water. 31. Athens. 31 people who had stood somewhere like this parking lot, who had been searched and cuffed and humiliated, and who had gone home and filed paperwork that had been absorbed by the same system that produced the officers who did it to them. 31 complaints that had become a file that had become a 400-page case document that had been building for over a year and still hadn't finished building until a Saturday afternoon when 2 women stopped for gas. "Mother," Taft said Crestfield. "Do you need me?" "I'll still make it," Mara said. "Elise has the car. We're 2 hours out if we leave in the next 40 minutes. I can have someone drive you." "We'll drive ourselves." She paused. "We need to drive ourselves." Taft nodded like she understood this, which she probably did. Elise didn't speak for the first 20 minutes of the drive south. This was not unusual for her. Elise processed inward before she processed outward, which was a quality that served her extremely well as a prosecutor and somewhat less well in her personal life, and she made peace with the trade-off. I drove and didn't push it. The highway rolled out through the afternoon, the landscape going from the flat commercial sprawl of the highway corridor to something older and quieter, pines and red clay and small churches on county roads. It was Elise who broke it. "You activated the transmitter before you even asked for our IDs. After. Mara said it was after 2 minutes after. Still. "You were already—" "I'd been reading Harlow County for 6 weeks, Mara said. "The pattern of stops on that highway exit has 3 flags in the task force file. When the 3rd cruiser blocked us in, I wasn't going to wait." Elise was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know how deep in you were." "You should have told me," Mara glanced at her eyes. Elise was looking out the passenger window, and Mara could see the set of her jaw, which was the particular set that meant she wasn't angry so much as working through whether she had the right to be. "I couldn't," Mara said. "Not the specifics, you know that. I'm coordinating prosecutor on the same task force. On a parallel file. There's a reason those walls exist. There's a reason they're frustrating too." Mara didn't argue with that, because Elise was right and arguing would have been the wrong response. Instead, she said, "You held up back there." Elise made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I've cross-examined people who tried harder than Braddock to make me feel small." Still, Mara said. Elise agreed, and some of the jaw loosened. They drove another 10 miles before Elise said, "Mom can't know any of this." "Not going to. She'll ask why we're late." "Construction," Mara said. "Outside Harlow." Elise looked at her. "There is road construction that's outside Harlow, I know. I checked the route this morning." Elise shook her head slowly. "You're a terrifying person, Mara." "That's a recent development," Mara said, and she meant it to land lighter than it did. They got to Crestfield at 4:17 in the afternoon. The house was the same house. It had always been a single-story brick ranch on Alderman Street, with a driveway that had never quite leveled out, and a screened porch their father had built the summer before Mara's first deployment, and that had been losing a battle with time and weather ever since. The car in the driveway belonged to Mrs. from next door, who had been checking in on Nadine 3 times a week since the diagnosis, and who was the kind of neighbor that made a person feel like the world wasn't entirely indifferent to individual lives. Nadine Voss was in the living room in the chair by the window, which was where she'd been conducting most of her recovery. And she looked up when Mara and Elise came through the door with an expression that said she'd been listening for the car for the better part of an hour. She was thinner than she'd been at Christmas. Her hair was coming back in fine and slightly darker than before, and she'd covered it with the soft blue wrap that Elise had sent from Nashville in February. She looked tired in the specific way of someone who'd been fighting something physical for a long time and was cautiously beginning to believe the fighting had worked. "You're late," she said. "Road construction," Elise said, and kissed her mother's cheek. "Outside Harlow." "I saw something on the news about Harlow County," Nadine said. "Some kind of federal situation at a gas station." Aya set her bag down by the door and said nothing. "Like a mess," Nadine said. "Looked like it," Marissa said. Mrs. Puente appeared from the kitchen with a dish towel and the expression of someone who had been feeding people through crisis long enough to read a room accurately. She looked at Mara, then at Elise, then back at Mara. "They're soups," she said, "and I made 2 pans of cornbread. So don't tell me you're not hungry, because I'll know you're lying." They stayed 2 nights. The visit had a quality to it that Mara hadn't expected, not the careful tenderness of the last few times she'd visited her mother in treatment, but something more ordinary than that. Nadine complained about the soap opera she'd been watching, which had killed off a character she'd followed for 9 years in what she described as a completely unnecessary creative decision. Got into a low-grade debate with her about a recipe that had apparently been contested in the family for decades. Mara fixed the screen door latch on the porch that had been loose for a year, found a hardware store that was open on Sunday, bought the correct size of screw, and spent 40 minutes on it while her mother watched from the porch chair and offered opinions. Ways did like fixing things, Nadine said. It's a loose latch. Not complicated. That's not what I mean. Mara turned the screwdriver and said nothing. Nice. Tells me you're still doing the traveling work, Nadine said. Giles. That's right. You like it? I thought about this genuinely. I like the variety, she said. New departments, new systems. You learn a lot about how hospitals actually work versus how they say they work. Nadine adjusted the blue wrap. You been somewhere interesting recently? Gotcha, Mara said. Harlow County area. That's where the thing was on the news. All world, Mara said. Nadine looked at her for a moment with the look she'd had since Mara was 12, the one that meant she knew more than she was being told, and was deciding whether to say so. Then she looked back at the yard. Your grandmother had a pendant like the one you wear, she said. She never took it off either, I know, Mara said. Why? You told me she said it kept her honest, Nadine said. Whatever that meant. Mara turned the screwdriver one more time, and the latch clicked into place properly for the first time in what appeared to have been a long time. On Sunday afternoon, the three of them sat on the porch with lemonade from a can that Elise had found in the back of the refrigerator. The weather had broken slightly, not cool, but the particular version of hot that feels earned rather than punishing, and the street outside was quiet in the way streets get on Sunday evenings in small towns. And everything non-essential has closed, and people are in the final hours of not being anywhere they have to be. Mara's phone had been vibrating periodically since the night before. She checked the task force messages in the bathroom briefly and knew that the Harlow County situation had moved into its next phase: federal paperwork, preliminary charges, a press release being drafted in coordination with the U.S. Attorney's regional office. It wasn't her job to manage that phase. That was Taft's job, and Elise's and the chain above both of them. That job right now was to be on this porch. She was not always good at this, but she was aware of this. She drank the lemonade and let the street be quiet for a while. She drove back north on Monday morning alone. Elise was staying another day. She'd arranged it with her office, and their mother had not objected, which meant she had wanted it in the first place and simply hadn't said so. Aya left at 6:30 before the heat had fully committed to the day, with the windows down for the first hour and the radio on low. By the time she crossed the Harlow County line, the radio was off. She didn't stop at the gas station. She drove past the Fulton Road exit, without slowing, watching it appear in her peripheral vision and then recede. The canopy was still there, the two pump islands, the hand-painted window lettering. A different car at the far pump, a woman in a yellow shirt, filling up without anything particular happening to her. Tasha kept driving. Her rotation assignment for the next 4 weeks was at Devlin County General, a regional hospital 20 miles north of Harlow, which was where she had been based when she'd first begun documenting the stop patterns on the county highway. The hospital knew her as a traveling R nurse, covering a staffing gap in their trauma unit. The task force knew her as the field assets closest to the primary case geography. Either version was wrong. They were just different parts of the same person, and she'd been managing the seams between them for long enough that it rarely felt like management anymore. It just felt like how she moved through days. The hospital's parking lot was half full when she arrived at 8:45. She sat in the car for her usual 20 minutes, settle watching the morning shift rotate through the main entrance nurses finishing their last hour day, staff arriving with coffee cups, a group of residents moving in a cluster that was trying to look purposeful. She was still watching when her phone rang. It was Taft. She answered. There's a development, Taft said without preamble. She had never been a person who started phone calls with "How are you?" which was a quality Mara had always respected. The Braddock situation has moved faster than we anticipated. What happened? His attorney filed for an emergency suppression hearing this morning. They're claiming the transmitter data is inadmissible on Fourth Amendment grounds. Specifically, it notes its specific right to record in a law enforcement encounter without prior judicial authorization. Dura was quiet for a moment. That argument doesn't hold. The T7 records activity that I, as a federal agent in an active field assignment, am a participant in. I know what it is, Taft said. The argument doesn't need to hold. It needs to create a delay, and the attorney they've got is not doing this because she thinks she'll win. She's doing it because someone wants time. That's what I think. Aya looked at the hospital entrance, a patient being wheeled in an IV pole rolling alongside a nurse jogging to catch the door. Asked, "Who hired the attorney?" she asked. There was a pause on Taft's end that longer than informational pauses usually lasted. That's the part that complicates things, Taft said. She's retained by a firm out of Atlanta that has represented Harlow County's department in 3 previous federal complaints. But the retainer for this particular filing was paid by a separate entity, LLC. What LLC? That's what we're pulling on, Taft said. The registered agent for the LLC is a name you're going to recognize from the case file. Mara sat up straighter. Tell me there's a county commissioner named Gerald Hatch, Taft said. He's been in his seat for 11 years. He appears in the task force file in connection with the 2021 holding cell incident, the one that lasted 11 days. He was the official who signed off on the extended detention authorization. Kid knew the name. She knew exactly where it appeared in the file, and she knew that its significance had always been treated as secondary, a background detail, an administrative endorsement, the kind of thing that looked like paperwork until you looked at it longer. He's not just connected to Braddock, she said. He's running protection. That's what this suggests, Taft said. The LLC was formed 8 months ago. Athens. The same month the task force investigation was formally opened. 8 months. Mara turned that over. Someone had known or suspected or been warned 8 months ago that the federal case was coming. And they had begun building cover for it. This isn't just about Braddock, she said. No, Taft said. It isn't outside. The parking lot had filled in around her. A car was waiting for her space. Turn signal on the driver, watching her through the windshield, with the patient expression of someone who had all the time in the world and also wanted her to move immediately. Claire's phone buzzed against her ear. A second incoming call, unknown number, local Georgia area code. I'm getting another call, she said. I'll send you the filing documents, Taft said. We need a call this afternoon, case team only 3 o'clock. I'll be there, Mara said. She switched to the incoming call. The voice on the other end was male, older, unhurried in the way of someone who had arranged to be unhurried. Voss, the voice said. Or do you prefer Nurse Voss? I understand you use both, depending on the day. Felt something go very still in the center of her chest. Who is this, she said, a brief pause, almost polite. I'm someone who wants you to understand something before this goes any further, the voice said. What happened at that gas station was an embarrassment, an overreach by officers who should have known better. Nobody is going to argue with that. Another pause. But the case you're building on top of it, the larger case that's going to cost certain people a great deal. And people who are about to lose a great deal sometimes become unpredictable. Not a threat, Mara said. It's information, the voice said. I'm just sharing information the way I understand it. That's what you do too. I'm disconnected. Mara sat in the car for 30 seconds without moving. Then she opened her contacts, found Taft's number, and called back. Person who wanted time, she said when Taft picked up. They just called me directly. Taft didn't say anything for a moment when Mara told her. That particular silence meant she was already moving pieces on a board that had just gotten more complicated. The voice, Taft said, male. Older 60, maybe 65. Unhurried. The kind of unhurried that's practiced. Mara was still sitting in the parking lot. Car that had wanted her space had given up and moved on. Used my name, both names. He knew I was in the field as a nurse. That's not public. No, it's not. The call came in on your personal number or the rotation phone. Personal. Another silence, shorter. Then we have a leak. Had already arrived at this conclusion approximately 30 seconds before Taft said it, which was the problem with conclusions you didn't want. They arrived on their own schedule, regardless of whether you were ready for them. Meant someone with access to task force personnel data. That was a closed file. It had 4 authorized holders at the field level and 8 at the administrative level, and none of those 12 were supposed to know enough about Mara's specific cover identity to connect both names in a single sentence. How confident are you in your team, Mara asked. Completely, Taft said, and then after a beat, which means it's not my team. The U.S. Attorney's Coordination Office. That's where I'm starting, Taft said. Clock is still on. Don't discuss this call with anyone before then. In writing. Not on any device connected to the task force system. Understood. And Mara Taft's voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but more direct in a way that wasn't about the case. If that call was a threat dressed up as information, then whoever made it has already decided you're the pressure point. I know that changes your field posture. I know that too, Mara said. I'll be at the 3 o'clock. She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand for a moment, looking at the hospital entrance. The morning rush had thinned. A janitor was mopping near the automatic doors, working in the careful, systematic way of someone who understood that this was the part of the job nobody watched. but everybody benefited from. She went inside and started her shift. Work had a quality that Mara had never found a clean way to describe to people who hadn't done it, not the dramatic version that television had decided was representative, but the actual texture of it. It was mostly waiting in a state of readiness, punctuated by periods where multiple things happened at once and required you to be in several places simultaneously, which was physically impossible but professionally expected. The skill wasn't heroism. The skill was trashing your own attention in real time, deciding which of 4 simultaneous problems was most likely to become catastrophic in the next 90 seconds if you didn't address it first. 9. County General's ER ran 2 trauma bays and a stabilization room that doubled as overflow on busy nights. 5. The charge nurse on the Monday morning shift was a compact, energetic woman named Petra, who had been at the hospital for 16 years, and who ran her department the way a good NCO runs a unit, not with authority as performance, but with authority as clarity. 5. She'd been skeptical of traveling nurses in general when Mara arrived 6 weeks earlier, and had become less skeptical by the end of the first week, which was about as fast as Mara had ever achieved that particular transition. "You look like you had a weekend," Petra said, when Mara came through the department door. "Driving," Mara said, and Petra handed her a chart. "Chest pain in Bay 2. EKG looks like stable angina, but the patient's 41 and doesn't believe anything's wrong with him, so he's been difficult. I can work with difficult. I know you can. That's why I'm giving him to you instead of to Hayward, who will tell him something irritating and make it worse." I took the chart and went to Bay 2. The patient was a man named Dennis who had driven himself to the ER from a construction site and who felt that the combination of his age, his physical condition, lives, and his personal philosophy regarding medical intervention made the current situation approximately as serious as a mild inconvenience. 5. He had the particular brand of denial that sometimes appeared in men who had spent their professional lives operating in environments where showing discomfort was culturally impermissible. I told the other one. He said, "This is probably just indigestion." At her. "It was indigestion," Mara said, scanning the EKG readout. "Your EKG is telling me something different. EKGs are wrong all the time. Sometimes. Not usually in the ways yours is." She set the chart down and looked at him directly. "Left. Anterior descending artery is showing a pattern that I've seen before, and don't ignore. We're going to run a troponin panel, and while we wait on that, you're going to stay on this bed and not argue with me about it." He looked at her for a moment. "You're blunt. I'm in a hurry," she said. "Not. Because I don't care about your opinion. Because if I'm right, every 10 minutes matters." He stayed on the bed. The troponin came back elevated. He was transferred to cardiology within the hour. He wasn't happy about it, and he also wasn't dead, which in Mara's experience was the relevant metric. She moved through the morning in the rhythm. The ER demanded a laceration in the waiting room that had been bleeding for 2 hours, because the man who had it didn't want to bother anyone. Pediatric asthma case that required the specific kind of calm that children could feel through your hands when you were helping them breathe, a possible fracture that turned out to be a definite fracture when the imaging came back. She didn't think about Gerald Hatch or the LLC or the voice on the phone. She thought about what was in front of her because that was how the work functioned, and also because it was the only way she knew to be in 2 very different lives without losing the thread of either. 40, she was at the nurse's station, writing up the fracture notes when Petra appeared at her elbow. "Someone here for you," Petra said, in the tone she used when something was slightly outside the normal category of things. "Outpatient family." "No, he says he's from the county commissioner's office." "It was personal business, not hospital business, but he wanted to talk to you before your lunch break." Put the pen down slowly. "What does he look like?" 50 suit for a Monday, smiling too much. She'd heard that description applied to emissaries before. It was a particular professional type, the man sent to deliver a message with enough deniability built into the delivery that the message could be denied later. Not threatening, not hostile, visibly reasonable. Carrying something underneath all of it. "Tell him I'll be out in 10 minutes, Mara said. She went to the supply room, which was the one place in the department where she could make a phone call without it being observed, and she called Taft. "Someone from the commissioner's office is at the hospital," she said. "In person. Wants to talk before lunch. Don't meet him alone." "I am not going to. I can have someone there in 40 minutes. That's too long. And it changes the dynamic if he sees a federal vehicle." Mara thought quickly. "I have a colleague here, Petra. She's former law enforcement municipal retired. I trust her as read on people. That's not the same as..." "I know. I'll take her as far as the lobby and do the conversation in a visible public space." Audio on the T7. "Is the device active?" "It will be by the time I get to the lobby," Mara said. The man in the lobby was exactly as Petra had described 50s, a charcoal suit that cost more than anything currently available at the Harlow County Mall, and a smile that was doing a lot of work on behalf of a face that would have otherwise been difficult to read. He had introduced himself to the front desk as Warren Gould, which was a name Mara pulled from the case file in approximately 3 seconds. Warren Gould, Chief of Staff to County Commissioner Gerald Hatch, 7 years in the position, appeared in 2 background filings. Toward him, and he stood, extending his hand. Voss. She shook it, Mr. Gould. Ms. Voss. He glanced at Petra, who had positioned herself near the reception desk with a cup of coffee in the particular quality of someone who is not listening, but absolutely is. I appreciate you coming out. I know you're in the middle of a shift. I have about 15 minutes, Mara said. She gestured to the seating area. Of 2 chairs, a small table, a sightline to the front desk and the entrance. She sat with her back to the wall, settled into the other chair, and crossed his legs and arranged the smile again. I'm going to be straightforward with you, he said, which was a sentence that in Mara's experience was only ever followed by someone being indirect. Please, she said. Commissioner Hatch is aware that there's a federal situation developing around some officers in the county sheriff's department, Gould said. He wants you to know that he's deeply troubled by what he's heard about Saturday's incident. He thinks those officers acted poorly and that accountability is appropriate. That's good to hear, Mar said. He also wants to make sure that the investigation stays focused on the individuals who are actually responsible, Gould said. It doesn't expand into areas that might inadvertently sweep up people and institutions that have genuinely been trying to create a better system in this county. Where it was. Mara kept her face exactly where it was. That's always the goal of a federal investigation, she said. Accountability. For what the evidence supports, of course. Gould nodded. The commissioner has a great deal of institutional knowledge about how the department operates. He'd be very open to a conversation with your task force, a cooperative one that might help focus the inquiry productively. I'll pass that along. To the appropriate people, Marissa said. He'd prefer to have that conversation sooner rather than later, Gould said. Before certain filings move forward, filings move on their own schedule, Mara said. I don't control that from here. No, Gould agreed. You have influence, I'd imagine, someone in your position. He paused, and the smile adjusted slightly. Boss, we did some background on you. Ms. Beese, your Army cred is impressive. Your nursing work, the various placements, all of it speaks to someone who is genuinely committed to doing good. We think there's a real opportunity here to accomplish something positive for this county without things getting more complicated than they need to be. What kind of complicated are you concerned about? Mara said. Gould said, where good people get caught in the edges of something that was aimed at someone else. He looked at her with an expression that was calibrated to communicate concern and goodwill, and nothing that could be quoted. Your mother is recovering, I understand, in Crestfield. That must be a difficult time for your family. The mention of her mother landed like a flat hand on the table between them, or it didn't move. She kept her breath even and her face where it was. And she let the silence sit for exactly as long as it took for Gould to understand that the mention had been noted and catalogued and would not produce the effect he was hoping for. Mr. Gould, she said, I'm going to finish my shift now. If Commissioner Hatch wants to speak with federal investigators, he should contact the U.S. Attorney's regional office and request a meeting through proper channels. That's the productive path forward. Gould stood also. The smile hadn't changed. I hope you'll think about what we discussed, he said. I will. Mara said she would just nod in the direction he meant. Back to the department. Petra fell in beside her at the corridor. That man, Petra said, looking straight ahead, has never once in his life given someone information out of the goodness of his heart. No, Mara agreed. He hasn't. The 3 o'clock call had 9 people on it. Taft 3 other field agents, 2 attorneys from the U.S. Attorney's office, a deputy chief from the task force's administrative arm, and Elise, who joined from Crestfield on her laptop with their mother's television audible in the background until she found a quieter room. Mara had sent the full audio from the Gould conversation before the call started. She'd also sent Taft the timestamp of the moment Gould mentioned Crestfield and her mother. Taft opened the call with it. The Gould conversation represents a second contact attempt in less than 8 hours, she said. The first was a direct phone call to Agent Voss's personal number, identity unknown. It was a face-to-face approach at her field cover location. Both referenced information that should not be accessible to the task force chain. She paused. We are treating this as a confirmed internal exposure. Because of this call, All non-essential communication on the task force system is suspended pending an internal review. One of the U.S. Attorney's attorneys, a man named Selby, who Mara had spoken to twice before, spoke up. Suppression. Filing from Braddock's team also references specific details about the T7's activation sequence that don't appear in any public filing. That information would only be available through task force file, Taft said. Yes, we know the call proceeded. The suppression hearing was scheduled for Thursday in federal district court. Argument being made that the transmitter data was inadmissible, was legally thin but not frivolous, and the attorney making it, a woman named Kovacs, who worked out of Atlanta, was not the kind of attorney who took cases she expected to lose in the conventional sense. She was the kind of attorney who used hearings as mechanisms for discovery. Elise's voice came through with a slight delay from the connection. What's Kovacs looking for in discovery? Task force personnel, Selby said. If she can establish that the undercover assignment was authorized through a defective warrant, or that the field agent's dual role created a legal conflict, she can argue contamination of the entire evidentiary chain. The assignment authorization is solid, Taft said. It's solid if it holds up to scrutiny, Selby said. If someone has already given Kovacs a thread to pull on, that scrutiny could get uncomfortable. Had been quiet through most of the calls. She spoke now. There's something else, she said. The LSA that paid Braddock's retainer was formed 8 months ago. The task force file was opened. Someone warned Hatch, or Hatch found out some other way that we were coming. If that's true, there may be document destruction that's already happened. Materials that were in the department's records that aren't anymore. Pause on the call. That's a significant problem, Selby said. Also a provable one, Mara said. If we can establish that the LLC was formed in direct response to the task force, opening same timeframe, overlapping personnel, coordinated attorney engagement, that's obstruction. That's a federal charge that sits above what we already have on Braddock. Also exposes Hatch directly. Elise said. Yes, Mara said. Taft was quiet for a moment. What do we need to make that provable? The LLC's formation documents, which are public record and already pulled. The retainer agreement, which Kovacs will have to partially disclose during the hearing. And the internal department communications around the time of formation, specifically anything touching the 2021 holding cell incident, because that's the event that would have made Hatch most nervous about a federal review. That's department communications, Taft said. If Hatch already moved to destroy them. They may not be entirely gone, Mara said. Harlow County uses a shared county administrative system for interoffice communication. The department and the commissioner's office are both on it. That system is hosted through a state contract, which means the backups are held at the state level, not the county level. Silence on the call. The state IT archive, Selby said slowly. Accessed. Through a state-level subpoena, Mara said. Not a county one. Hatch can't touch it from his position. The call shifted after that. It became the kind of call where decisions were being made rather than problems being described. Assigned the state subpoena to Selby's team. The suppression hearing strategy was adjusted. Elise was formally moved to a direct prosecutorial role on the expanded case, which required a brief discussion about the ethical walls given her prior involvement, which she navigated with the precision of someone who had spent years knowing exactly where the lines were and exactly how to work up against them without crossing. By the time the call ended, it was 4:15. Mara was in the hospital break room with a cup of coffee she didn't remember making. Through the window above the sink, she could see the parking lot going golden with the late afternoon light, long shadows from the pine trees at the lot's edge reaching across the asphalt. She thought about the voice on the phone, the deliberate patience of it. Someone who was confident enough in their position to make the call themselves rather than sending another Gould. That confidence was a data point. It meant they believed they had leverage that hadn't been deployed yet. She didn't know what it was. Not knowing was the part she disliked. The danger. She had a functional relationship with danger. They'd been acquainted for years. The not knowing was the part that required discipline, the part where you had to accept incomplete information and continue moving forward without the comfort of a complete picture. She drank the coffee and went back to her shift. The state subpoena came through faster than anyone had expected. Selby's team had moved quickly, and the presiding judge had approved it without the usual delay, which meant either the stars had aligned administratively or someone in the state system had been waiting for exactly this kind of request. Archived communications from Harlow County's administrative system were transferred to the federal case server at 9:17 on Tuesday morning. Mara was in the middle of a shift when Taft sent her a single message. You were right. On by. She stood by through 2 more hours of her shift, thinking about it in the margins of her attention. The way you think about something important that you can't look at directly while you're doing something else. When her break came, she found a quiet corner of the hospital's second-floor waiting room, the one outside the surgical ward that was usually empty in the late morning, and called Taft back. Call me. She said the archived communications have a gap, Taft said. 14 months of internal department records from 2020 to early 2022 are intact. Then there's a deletion event in March of last year, county-level admin action, logged under a service maintenance code, and the records from the 6 months following the task force opening are largely gone. But not entirely, Taft confirmed. The state backup system runs on a 72-hour lag. Whatever was deleted at the county level had already been copied to the state archive. Of it, anyway. Enough. What did you find? Taft exhaled once, which was the closest she came to expressing satisfaction. 3 emails between Braddock and Hatch's office. 2 from Hatch's personal aide, 1 from Hatch directly. All dated within the first 3 weeks after the task force was opened. They don't name the task force by name. Whoever warned Hatch used language that was vague enough to be deniable, but they reference the need to clean up the Terrell matter. Sat up the 2021 holding cell. The man's name was Calvin Terrell, Taft said. 7-day detention. The emails discuss making sure that the file doesn't create problems going forward, and that Braddock's discretion is appreciated. One of them. The one from Hatch directly says, and I'm quoting here, the situation we discussed last fall should be considered resolved as far as the office is concerned. I'll make sure you're covered if anything comes back around. The word covered sat in the room with Mara covered. The institutional version of we took care of it. The language of people who have decided that protection is a currency. They can move between each other the way other people move money. That's explicit enough, Mara said. It's explicit enough, Taft said. Combined with the LLC formation timeline and the Gould approach, we have a pattern that a jury can follow. And his Selby file. He wants to do it before the suppression hearing Thursday. If we file the expanded obstruction and conspiracy charges against Hatch before Kovacs gets into that courtroom, it changes the entire context of her argument. She's no longer defending against an incident at a gas station. She's defending against the first visible edge of a much larger case. I thought about this. She might pull Braddock's defense. She might double down, which would be worse for her client, but better for our record. Taft paused. There's one more thing. Tell me the voice on the phone. We've been running the call, the personal number you were reached on. We traced the origin cell tower. The call was placed from inside Harlow County, from a residential area 3 blocks from the commissioner's office. Hatch called me himself. We think so. Which means he's more exposed than he knows, because we now have his location at the time of the call, his voice on a recording. The T7 captured the full conversation, and a direct line from that call to the Gould visit 6 hours later. Let this settle. Hatch had called her himself, not through an aide, not through a system. He had picked up a phone and made the call because he believed he was the kind of person who could say what he'd said without consequence. He'd been covered for so long he'd confused the cover with actual safety. The hearing is Thursday, Mara said. Yes, in the filings. Tomorrow afternoon. Taft said Selby's team is finalizing overnight. I want you on standby from 7 a.m. Wednesday. There may be a response from Hatch's side when the filing hits public record, and I want you in a position to move quickly if it changes anything in your vicinity. Understood, Mara said. How are you doing? Taft said. The question surprised her. Not because Taft was incapable of asking it, but because she'd never asked it mid-operation before. Fine, Mara said. He mentioned your mother, Taft said. I heard it in the audio. He didn't. Looked out at the surgical ward corridor, where a nurse was pushing a cart and a doctor was walking with a chart, and someone somewhere was being wheeled from one room to another in the quiet, continuous movement of a hospital that never fully stops. I've handled harder things than a man in a nice suit. Telling me my family is a pressure point, she said. I know where the lines are. Okay, Taft said. I need you to make sure Elise is flagged, Mara said. She's still in Crestfield with our mother. If Hatch is willing to drop that name in a conversation, I want someone keeping an eye on it. Already done, Taft said. Since Monday afternoon. Exhaled. Thank you. She went back to her shift. Wednesday. It came with cloud cover that had moved in from the west overnight, and the air had gone from the flat, pressing heat of the past week to something heavier. Not cooler exactly, but charged in the way that precedes weather. Mara drove to the hospital in the gray morning light and sat in the parking lot for her usual 20 minutes watching the sky. Albie's team filed at 2:14 in the afternoon. Expanded charges: obstruction of justice, conspiracy to deprive civil rights, abuse of public office, and aiding and abetting the cover-up of the 2021 unlawful detention of Calvin Terrell were filed against Gerald Hatch, Commissioner, County, Georgia, in federal district court. Filing was 47 pages. It named Braddock, Fenwick, Doss, and Hatch as co-defendants and detailed a pattern of coordinated misconduct spanning 5 years. Was between patients when Taft sent her the confirmation. She read it in the corridor outside Bay 3 and then put her phone in her pocket and went back to work, because the filing was Selby's and the hearing was 2 days away. And what she could control right now was the man in Bay 3, whose blood pressure was at a level that required her full attention. At 4:50, Petra found her at the nurse's station. "You've got another visitor," Petra said. Her voice was different this time. Queter Mara looked up. "Nice. This one's not from the commissioner's office," Petra said. "She's a patient brought in by ambulance 40 minutes ago. She's asking for you by name, said she knows you from the case." Case. She didn't say. Petra's jaw was tight. Shape. Mara. Head laceration, 2 broken ribs, possible concussion. She said something happened to her car, that it wasn't an accident. It was already moving. The woman in the treatment room was in her mid-40s, compact, with gray-streaked hair that had been partially matted with dried blood from the laceration above her left ear. She was conscious, but moving in and out of the sharper kind of attention, the way people do when a concussion is sitting on them like a weight. Her wrists had marks on them that were not from the car. Came around to the side of the bed and checked her pupils first, not even from her, just reflex from the situation. Active. "Good, I'm Mara Voss," she said. "You asked for me." Iman's eyes focused. "I know who you are," she said, and her voice was rough in the way of someone who had been crying and was past it now. "My name is Sandra Terrell." She stopped, breathed carefully, the way people breathe when their ribs are broken, and every inhale is a negotiation. "Calvin was my husband, the 11-day detention. 2021. The man in the emails." Mara kept her face steady and her voice level and said, "I'm listening." "I've been trying to file a formal complaint for 2 years, Sandra Terrell said. Every time I tried, something happened. My employer got a call. My landlord got a call. 3 weeks ago, someone went through my car." She paused to breathe again, slow and careful. "Today they didn't just go through it." She turned her head slightly and looked at Mara with the particular clarity that comes when someone has been afraid for so long that the fear has compacted into something dense and certain. "A note," she said on the seat after. "Have it." Sandra Terrell reached slowly into the pocket of her hospital gown and produced a folded piece of paper that had a smear of blood on one corner, and she held it out. Ada took it, unfolded it. Words, printed in block letters, name paper, identifying marks, it or else, and below that in smaller letters an address. I recognized the address. It was her mother's house in Crestfield. I folded the note along its original crease and held it by the corner and did not put it down. Fine. Her mind ran the address again, the way you run a calculation twice when the first answer is one you don't want to be correct. Alderman Street, Crestfield. The house with the uneven driveway and the screen porch and the blue wrap, and Mrs. from next door, coming by 3 times a week with soup. She ran it a second time and it came out the same. She looked at Sandra Terrell, whose broken ribs were moving in careful increments with each breath, and whose eyes were watching Mara's face with the exhausted focus of someone who had been waiting a long time to hand this particular weight to someone else. "When did you find this?" Mara said after. "When I got out of the car. I was disoriented. I didn't know right away how bad it was. I found it on the passenger seat." Sandra paused, breathed. I didn't call the police. That was the right call, Mara said. She stepped out of the treatment room, walked 6 feet down the corridor to where there was no one within earshot and called Taft. Taft answered on the second ring. Sandra Terrell is at Devlin County General, Mara said. Alvin Terrell's widow. She's targeted vehicle incident today. Not accidental physical injuries consistent with assault. Note. Mara read the address. The silence on Taft's end lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Is anyone with your mother right now? Taft said. 20 goes over at 5. Elise is still there. I'm pulling the agents on the Crestfield watch and moving them closer to the house. Don't call Elise yet. I don't want her to move your mother before our people are positioned. How long? 12 minutes, Taft said. Stay on the line with me. Mara stayed on the line. She stood in the corridor with her back against the wall and watched the ER move around her a tick, pushing a cart, a resident talking to a patient's family in the half-open doorway of a room. The ordinary motion of a building full of people who were having the worst days of their lives and being held together by the people around them. 7 minutes later, Taft said, "We have eyes on the house. Ice is inside. Your mother is in the living room. There's no one on the property who shouldn't be there." Mara exhaled. "Okay, now call your sister." Eyes. Elise picked up after one ring, which meant she'd been expecting the call or something like it, which meant she was paying more attention to the situation than she'd been letting on during the visit. I told her concisely, note, address federal agents outside, stay inside, don't open the door to anyone who doesn't identify through the window first. Said Mom. Don't tell her yet, Mara said. Not tonight. She doesn't need it tonight. She's going to ask why I'm not going to bed at a normal hour. Tell her, you're working. She'll know something's wrong. She knows something's always wrong, Mara said. She just doesn't push it. Let her not push it tonight. A pause. Are you okay? I'm fine. I have a patient I need to get back to. Mara. I'm fine, Elise. She went back to Sandra Terrell's room and spent the next hour managing the practical realities. The laceration was cleaned and closed with 6 sutures. The imaging confirmed 2 fractured ribs, but no pneumothorax. The concussion protocol was started, and Sandra's blood pressure, which had been elevated on arrival, came down to a level that was unhappy but survivable. I did these things with the precision the work required, and in the spaces between tasks, she was also doing something else, which was building a sequence in her head. Sandra Terrell. The note, the address. The timing filed at 2:14. Puffin's note delivered by 4:30. 2 hours between the public filing and a message written on paper and left on the seat of a car belonging to the widow of the man whose case had just been named in federal court. That had known. The filing was coming before it hit public record. Ike wasn't past tense. The leak was still active. She finished Sandra's chart at 6:40 and found Petra at the nurse's station. She needs an overnight room, Mara said, not under her name on the board. Petra looked at her for a moment. How not under her name? Complete. Petra pulled up the system without asking for more explanation. She had worked 16 years in this building, and she understood in the practiced way of someone who had seen things that required discretion that some requests were not about hospital policy and some of those requests were the right ones. I'll put her in 214, Petra said. It's been down for maintenance. Technically unoccupied. Thank you, Mara said. Don't thank me. Go eat something. You look like you've been running on coffee and adrenaline for 3 days, Mara said. She called Taft again from her car at 7:15, with the engine running and the windows up. Timing, she said. 2 hours after the filing. Inside the chain told them. I know, Taft said. We've been running the access log on the case server since you called. The filing document was accessed 14 minutes before Selby's team submitted it by a user account in the U.S. Attorney's Coordination Office, who a paralegal named Greer Addison. She's been in office 18 months. Her access level shouldn't have included the filing queue. There was an admin error when she was onboarded that gave her read access to a document category. She wasn't cleared for... She's been in the building. We picked her up 20 minutes ago. Pressed her fingers against her forehead. An admin error. 18 months of exposure because someone had checked the wrong box in an access management system during onboarding. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a mole recruited through pressure or ideology or money, or maybe it was all of those things, but the entry point was a checkbox. Talking. Mara said. She's talking, Taft said. 5. She was passing information to a contact she knew only by a phone number. 9. We're running the number, it'll go back to something disposable, Mara said. Probably. But it also gives us her full access history, and she was passing summaries, not documents. Which means whoever was receiving them had to interpret them. That interpretation process leaves traces, Hatch, Mara said. 5. We think so, we'll know more by morning. Mara looked at the hospital entrance. A family was coming out, a man, a woman, a child between them, holding both their hands, all of them moving in the specific direction of people who have just received news that is bad but not the worst. That particular gait. She knew it from years of watching people leave hospitals. The hearing is tomorrow, she said. 8 a.m. Kovacs filled a motion to postpone 2 hours ago, citing the expanded charges as prejudicial to the Braddock defense. The judge denied it. We're on. I want to be there. I know you do, Taft said. You're not a named witness in the hearing. Your field cover is still technically active. It won't be after tomorrow. A pause. No, Taft said. Fuck. The federal courthouse in the district sat on a block of downtown that had been renovated sometime in the 90s and had held up reasonably well, which was more than could be said for the surrounding blocks. Mara arrived at 7:20 and sat in the car on the street for a while, watching the building fill. Attorneys, clerks, federal marshals doing their morning check of the entrance. 5. A news truck parked across the street, which meant someone had put the filing on their radar. 8. The expanded charges against a county commissioner had a different news value than a police misconduct case. 9. The word corruption pulled cameras in ways that excessive force, statistically more common and more damaging, often didn't. Taft met her on the courthouse steps at 7:45. They stood together in the flat morning light and didn't look like they were having a particular conversation. Addison's contact number. Purchased in Harlow County. 8 months ago, Taft said, watching the street. Perched at a convenience store. The store has exterior camera footage. 5. We pulled it this morning, Hatchgold, Taft said. Arn Gould. Purchasing a prepaid phone, paid cash. But the cameras don't care about cash. 5. Was the handler, Mara said. Hatch kept himself one step back. Until the phone call to you, Taft said, which was from his personal cell, which he apparently forgot wasn't covered the same way. The mistake of a man who had spent too long believing he was untouchable. He'd used the burner system for everything except the one call he'd made in person, the one where he'd wanted to sound himself authoritative, calm the man in charge, and that vanity had cost him the insulation he'd built everywhere else. His inside the suppression hearing lasted 4 hours and did not go the way Kovacs had planned. Voss sat in the gallery with Taft and 2 other task force agents. Elise was at the prosecutor's coordinating prosecutor, and she had the particular stillness she got when she was completely prepared, not relaxed, but still, the way a structure is still when all its load-bearing elements are correctly placed. Kovacs argued the transmitter inadmissibility with technical precision. She cited case law. She was good at what she did. She moved through her argument cleanly and without excess, and the judge, a deliberate woman named Hartwell, who had been on the federal bench for 22 years, and whose expression revealed nothing, listened without interruption. Then Selby stood and laid out the basis for admissibility in 12 minutes. The T7 had recorded an encounter in which a federal agent legally present and legally operating was a direct participant. There was no warrant required. There was no constitutional violation. Braddock's attorney was conflating the admissibility of participant recording with wiretap statute, a conflation that the case law she had cited, when read in full rather than in the excerpted form she'd presented, did not support. The judge ruled from the bench without recess admissible. All of it. Kovacs received the ruling with the controlled expression of an attorney who had known this was a possible outcome and had prepared her next position before the first one was decided. She conferred with Braddock for approximately 90 seconds. Then she stood and informed the court that her client wished to enter into preliminary discussions regarding a cooperation agreement. The The room shifted. Mara felt it, not dramatically, not the way a scene inverts in a film, but the actual physical quality of a room when the weight in it redistributes. Braddock sat at the defense table looking at the surface in front of him, and Mara looked at him and tried to find the man who had pressed her against a hot hood and whispered about no one coming to save her. And she found him still there, diminished, not by the room but by the gap between what he'd believed about himself and what the morning had established was actually true. Well, recessed for 30 minutes. In the corridor, Taft put her hand briefly on Mara's shoulder and then removed it, which was the closest she came to acknowledgement of anything personal. Cooperates, Taft said, and we have his direct testimony about the commissioner's involvement in the 2021 cover-up. He'll try to minimize his own role, Mara said. They always do. Doesn't mean the testimony is useless. What does Elise think? She thinks we don't need him, Taft said. She thinks the Addison access log, the Gould phone purchase, the email archive, and your recorded call with Hatch are enough without a cooperating witness who has obvious self-interest in shaping the story. She's probably right, Mara said. She usually is, Taft agreed, which was a sentence Mara was going to remember for a long time. Hatch was arrested at 11:40 a.m., while the court was still in recess. He was at his office, the commissioner's suite in the Harlow County Administrative Building, a room with a view of the courthouse from across the block. He would have been able to see the news truck from his window. He might have been watching it when the federal agents came through his door. He did not go quietly, which surprised Mara when Taft told her, because she had read him as a man who understood optics. Apparently there was a version of being cornered that stripped that understanding away, and Hatch found it, argued. He demanded his attorney. He said things that were recorded by the agent's body cameras, and that would later become part of the evidentiary record, which was a particular kind of irony that required no additional commentary. Aaron Gould was arrested at his home in the same hour. He did go quietly. He sat in the back of the federal vehicle with his hands in his lap and the look of a man doing rapid calculations about what cooperation might be worth. Mike, from the gas station, had already made his own calculation. He'd retained an attorney the day after his arrest and had been in preliminary conversations with the U.S. Attorney's Office since Monday. His account of events confirmed the T7 recordings and added 3 additional incidents that weren't in the existing case file. 2 unlawful searches that Braddock had ordered and that Fenwick had participated in without objecting, and 1 instance in which Braddock had explicitly told him that the commissioner's office had been informed about a particular stop and had signaled approval. That last piece was specific enough to be significant. It placed Hatch's knowledge not as general institutional cover but as active incident-specific authorization. The 3rd officer from the gas station had not retained an attorney and had not spoken with investigators, which his assigned public defender was now strongly advising him to reconsider. Drove back to the hospital after the recess ended and the hearing moved into its administrative phase. Her shift had been covered by a float nurse for the morning, and Petra had texted her twice with updates that were professionally worded, but had an undertone of someone who was tracking things carefully. She was pulling into the parking lot when her phone rang. Unknown number, Georgia area code. She pulled into a space and let it ring once more before answering. The voice was different from the first call. Younger, more clipped with the specific tension of someone making a call they had been instructed to make. I'm calling on behalf of Commissioner Hatch. The commissioner is in federal custody, Mara said. He has a message, the voice said. He wants you to know that the information about your task force's internal operations, the access logs, the personnel files, extends beyond what you've recovered. He says there are additional materials that haven't been submitted to anyone yet. Mara sat very still. For those materials not becoming a problem, the voice said. She recognized the move. It was the last play of someone who had run out of forward options. The threat to destroy what they couldn't keep, the claim of hidden leverage designed to buy negotiating room that didn't actually exist. She'd seen it before, not always this late in the sequence, not always this transparent, but the shape of it was familiar. She said, that this call is being recorded. That the suggestion of withholding materials relevant to a federal investigation constitutes an additional charge. 5. And that his attorney should advise him against making any further contact. 5. The call sent the audio to Taft when inside. Andra. Terrell was sitting up in room 214 when Mara looked in on her at the end of the afternoon. The television was unmuted, and Sandra was watching the news feed, showing a reporter standing outside the Harlow County Administrative Building. Red County Commissioner arrested on federal charges. Sandra watched it without expression for a moment, then looked at Mara. Is that because of today? She said. It's because of a lot of things, Mara said. It was part of it. Sandra looked back at the screen. Oven filed his first complaint in 2021, she said, 2 weeks after they let him out. He sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours working on the language. He wanted it to be right. He wanted them to take it seriously. She was quiet for a moment. They sent him a form letter. Mara didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the moment required. He filed 2 more after the second one. Someone called his employer. After the third one, we found our car had been gone through. She paused for a careful breath, managing the ribs. He died of a heart attack 14 months ago. I don't know if that's related to any of this. Doctors said stress. He was under a lot of stress. I'm sorry, Mara said. Aiken meant it in the plain way, without professional distance. Sandra looked at her. Are they actually going to face consequences, real ones? Yes. Mara said real ones. People say that. I know they do, Mara said. I'm saying it because I know what the file looks like. The emails, the recordings, the archive. There's enough that a defense attorney's job right now is damage control, not acquittal. Andra held her gaze for a moment, measuring. Then she looked back at the silent screen. His name is going to come up, she said in court. Good, Sandra said. He deserves to be mentioned. The news cycle picked up the Hatch arrest and ran with it through the evening. At 9 o'clock, 3 regional networks had the story, and 1 national outlet had put it on their politics feed, framing it as part of a broader federal effort against county-level corruption in rural jurisdictions. The framing was generally accurate. The details they had were partial, which was normal for this stage. Agata watched 6 minutes of it in the break room, standing with a sandwich. She was finally eating, because Petra had put it on the counter in front of her and said something pointed about blood sugar. The television showed the exterior of the courthouse, then footage of the administrative building, then a photograph of Hatch that had been taken from the county website, a professional headshot, slightly outdated, commissioner, in a good suit with a controlled smile. Lines. The same practice-managed presentation she'd heard on the phone. Eyes. She turned it off and finished the sandwich. Her phone buzzed. Ice. Mom wants to know why I keep checking the window. I told her. I thought I heard a cat. She says we don't have cats in this neighborhood and I should go to bed. And then after a pause, she also says she made extra cornbread and you should come back this weekend. Offer wrote back. Tell her I'll try. She put the phone in her pocket. The break room was empty and the hospital moved around her in its continuous way, and she thought about Calvin Terrell sitting at a kitchen table for 3 hours getting the language right for a complaint that became a form letter. She thought about 31 complaints that had become paperwork that went nowhere, and about the 400 pages of a case file that had been building for over a year to give those complaints somewhere to go. She was still thinking about it when her phone buzzed again. This time. Braddock finalized cooperation agreement. He's giving us everything, has documentation. We didn't have his own records. Of copies. Meet tomorrow 8 a.m. She stared at the message for a moment. Own records. A man who had buried complaints and covered misconduct had also apparently kept documentation of everything. That's insurance. Probably the file a man keeps when he's not sure how long the people above him will keep protecting him. A file that proves everyone's hands are dirty, so that if his become a problem, they become a problem together. She put the phone away and went back to the floor. At 10:15. She was finishing chart notes at the nurse's station when the ER entrance door opened, and a man came through in a way that was different from the usual way. People came through ER entrance doors. He wasn't panicked and he wasn't being helped. He was walking deliberately with the quality of someone who had practiced, looking like they belonged somewhere. 5. He stopped at the reception desk and gave a name that wasn't Sandra Terrell's, but asked in a casual conversational way whether there was a patient matching her general description. Older woman, gray hair, came in by ambulance, currently in any of the rooms. The receptionist, who had been briefed, said she couldn't share information and asked if he had a name. He gave a different name than the first one. The receptionist repeated that she couldn't share patient information. The man stood at the desk for about 15 seconds. He looked at the corridor. He looked at the rooms. He looked at the nursing station, and his eyes went across it and landed for a moment on Mara, who was looking at a chart and not at him. He left. Mara waited until the door closed and counted to 5 and then called Taft. Someone just came into my ER looking for Sandra Terrell, she said. Left. He's gone. He came through the main entrance and left through it. I'm sending you the physical description now. She pulled up the text field and typed it as she talked. We need to move her tonight, agreed, Taft said. Can you get her stable enough to transport? She's stable now. The ribs are painful but not complicated. Concussion is grade 2. She needs monitoring but not intensive. She can be moved if we have a destination federal safe house protocol, Taft said. I'll have a location and transport in 40 minutes. I'll have her ready, Mara said. She went to room 214 and explained the situation to Sandra Terrell in the straightforward way. She explained things that required immediate action and didn't benefit from softening. Sandra listened without interruption. Then she looked at the muted television, where the news was still running the courthouse footage, and then she looked at Mara. Sandra said. Less if possible, Mara said. Sandra nodded once and reached for the water cup on the tray beside her bed with her good arm, the one that didn't pull on the broken ribs, and took a careful sip. You know, Sandra said, when I found your name, when I saw it connected to what was happening with the department, I almost didn't come. Did you? Mara said. Sandra set the cup down. Because I figured if anyone was going to do something with it, it was going to be someone who'd already been in the parking lot. She paused. Someone who knows what it's like to stand there. I looked at her for a moment. Get your things, she said. I'll get the discharge paperwork started. She was back at the nurse's station when her pager went off Petra's extension, which she almost never used. What is it? There's a man outside, Petra said, her voice careful and even the one from earlier different. He came to the staff entrance, not the main doors. Badge. What kind of badge? Harlow County Sheriff's Department, Petra said. He says he's here on a welfare check for a patient. Or his hand tightened on the phone. Harlow County Sheriff's Department, whose department was currently without 3 of its officers, whose commissioner was in federal custody, and whose remaining active personnel had just had their entire institutional relationship with legal authority inverted in a federal courthouse that morning. Let him in, Mara said. Tell him you need to verify the request through the hospital administrator. Him. For how long? Mara was already moving toward room 214. I tell you to stop, she said. She moved fast, but not at a run, because running in a hospital corridor at night draws attention, and attention was the thing she needed least right now. 214 was 30 seconds from the nurse's station, at a brisk walk. She covered it in 25. Sandra Terrell looked up when she came through the door, and whatever she read in Mara's face made her swing her legs over the side of the bed without being told. Now, Sandra said. Now, Mara said, can you walk? Eyes. Yes, good. Don't carry anything you don't have in your hands already. Leave the TV box. She helped Sandra into the grip-soled hospital socks and the cardigan that had been folded on the chair, and she moved her into the corridor with a hand at her elbow. Steady, not rushed, the way you move a patient who needs support but not alarm. 20 feet away, it looked like a routine transfer. That was the point. She called Taft while they walked. There's a sheriff's department officer at my staff entrance, she said quietly enough that it didn't carry. Timing. Welfare check. We're moving now. Do you have a back route from the building? Nodding, Doc, Taft said immediately east side. I'm 15 minutes out, but I have an agent 6 minutes from your location. She'll come in the dock entrance. Her name is Webb. She'll show her credentials through the door window before you open it. Ice, but it's 5.5. Now, Taft said. Ice. She steered Sandra through the corridor junction, past the supply rooms through the door that connected to the service wing. Pythons. The fluorescent lighting back here was older and flickered slightly at one end, the kind of maintenance issue that had been on someone's list for a while. The floor changed from the polished mainward surface to bare utility tile. It smelled of industrial cleaner and cardboard. Sandra breathed, carefully managing the ribs, not complaining. Her face was set in the way of someone who has decided to absorb whatever the next 10 minutes require and process it afterward. Where are we going? Sandra asked, loading dock. In a federal vehicle. Then somewhere safe, Sandra said. Because it was simple, like, she hadn't spent 2 years being systematically pressured and threatened, and was now being walked through a hospital service corridor at night by a federal agent she'd met 6 hours ago. I reached the loading dock door. Mara positioned Sandra against the wall beside it, away from the window, and checked the door's small reinforced glass panel. Outside was dark and empty. The receiving area for supply deliveries, concrete platform, a roll-up door that was currently closed. Minutes. She watched the dock and listened for anything from the direction of the staff entrance, which was on the other side of the building. She heard nothing, which was either good or meant the officer had been let in. At 3 minutes and 40 seconds by her count, headlights appeared on the access road that ran behind the building. A dark sedan. No markings, moving at the deliberate speed of someone who knew where they were going. It pulled up to the dock platform and the driver's door opened. Got out, mid-30s, dark jacket, moved efficiently. She came to the dock door window and held her credentials flat against the glass. Mara checked the badge, checked the face, unlocked the door. Webb said, "Let's go," Mara said. She got Sandra down the dock steps slowly, because 2 broken ribs and a concrete step are not a combination you rush into the rear of the sedan. She got in beside her. Webb was already moving before the door fully closed. 7 minutes behind us, Webb said. We're going to a federal medical facility in the district. It's the safest option for her overnight. She needs rib monitoring and concussion checks every 4 hours, Mara said. I know, I sent ahead. Mara looked out the rear window as the hospital receded. The loading dock was empty and lit by a single overhead light. The building sat there in the dark, ordinary continuous, full of people who were still being taken care of by the people who remained. The sheriff's department officer at the staff entrance was detained by federal agents at 10:52 p.m. His name was Cutler, and he had been off his assigned shift for 3 hours when he arrived at the hospital. He was not responding to an official welfare check. He had no documentation, no call log, no supervisor authorization. When agents ran his phone, they found 17 messages to a number traced to Warren Gould's attorney's office, beginning 2 hours after Gould's arrest. The most recent, sent 40 minutes before Cutler arrived at the hospital, read, "She's at Devlin General, find out which room." He was charged with obstruction, tampering, and violating the terms of the department's standing order issued that afternoon by the interim sheriff, who had been appointed after Braddock's arrest, prohibiting department personnel from any contact with individuals connected to the federal investigation. He was the last loose piece, though nobody knew that yet that night. The next 3 weeks moved in the way of processes that have been set in motion and are now moving under their own weight, not fast, not cinematic, but with the particular relentlessness of a legal structure doing what it was built to do once the right materials are fed into it. The federal charges against Gerald Hatch were formally filed and unsealed: conspiracy to obstruct justice, abuse of public office, civil rights violations under color of law, and aiding and abetting the unlawful detention of Calvin Terrell. The Terrell matter, which had been a line in a case file for 2 years, became a named count in a federal indictment, which meant it had to be read aloud in a courtroom and entered into public record, which meant it could no longer be treated as paperwork that went nowhere. Warren Gould accepted a cooperation agreement. He testified in exchange for a reduced charge on the obstruction count, and his testimony placed Hatch at the center of the protection structure, not as a peripheral endorser, but as the architect. It was Hatch who had first been warned about the federal investigation. through a contact whose identity Gould not to know, but whose description matched a specific regional political operative that the task force had been watching for separate reasons. It was Hatch who had directed the LC formation, who had arranged the attorney retainer, who had approved the approach to Mara and the pressure campaign against Sandra Terrell. Gould had executed. Hatch had decided. The jury was not going to find this distinction as meaningful as Hatch's defense team hoped. Braddock's cooperation was more complicated. He was not, as it turned out, a simple man. He was a man who had made specific choices over many years and had constructed an internal narrative around those choices that bore no resemblance to their actual impact. His testimony was useful primarily because of the personal records he'd kept, the documentation of every arrangement, every nod from the commissioner's office, every complaint that had been routed to him for burial rather than investigation. He'd kept them the way people keep records when they're afraid, which is compulsively, and without clear intention, not planning to use them, not planning to share them, just unable to throw them away. 31 complaints. He had records of all 31. He had in several cases the original submission, the actual document the complainant had filed alongside his written assessment, which was a bureaucratic exercise in converting a real event into a notation that said something like reviewed. Further, action warranted. Reading those documents alongside each other in the federal record was its own kind of revelation. Not because it proved something that wasn't already known, but because it made legible in specific human detail the gap between what someone had reported and what the system had done with their report. Prosecuted the Hatch case personally. She had requested the assignment formally, which required a review of potential conflict given her prior task force role, and the review had cleared her on the grounds that her involvement in the investigative phase had been parallel rather than direct. She prepared for 6 weeks. She had the particular quality during preparation of someone who was not thinking about winning. She was thinking about making the record so complete, so specific, so relentlessly factual, that the jury's job would be the simplest thing they did that week. On the first day of trial, she stood in front of that jury and said, "This case is about what happens when the people responsible for protecting a community decide that protecting themselves is more important. We're going to show you exactly what that looks like. Not in general, but in specific, name by name, date by date, decision by decision." 5. She didn't promise them drama, she delivered evidence. Testified on the 4th day of the Hatch trial. 5. She had testified before in administrative proceedings, in internal review hearings, once in a civil case during her 2nd year with the task force. But she had not testified in open court in a case that she had been inside for 14 months, and she had not done it under her real name, with both her Army service record and her FBI assignment in the public record for the first time. 5. She wore the same silver pendant. She'd thought about leaving it at the apartment, and then decided against it, not for any strategic reason, just because it belonged there. 5. The courtroom was full, not packed in the dramatic sense, but full in the way of a proceeding that had drawn the people. It was supposed to draw journalists, county residents, family members of people whose complaints appeared in the record. The woman from the courthouse who had been taking notes in every session, and who Mara later found out had filed her own complaint in 2019 and received her own form letter. 5. The prosecutor on direct examination walked her through the gas station encounter in detail. 5. She answered each question completely and without embellishment. She described what had happened in the sequence it had happened, and she described what she had known at the time and what she hadn't, and she made no attempt to make herself sound like someone who had never felt anything during those 43 minutes in the heat. 5. Because she had felt things, she'd been angry. She'd been uncertain at points, not about the transmitter or the federal case, but about the timing, about whether she was waiting too long or not long enough, about whether Elise was going to be able to hold her position without it costing her something irreversible. She said this in the courtroom plainly because it was true and because it mattered that it was true. The case was not about an agent who had performed flawlessly in a controlled environment. It was about what had actually happened in a gas station on a Saturday afternoon. And what had actually happened was complicated and hot and uncomfortable, and ultimately documented with enough precision that the discomfort of it was preserved in full. On cross-examination, Hatch's defense attorney, not Kovacs, who had declined the expanded case, tried a version of the argument that the undercover assignment created an inherent bias in Mara's account, like that she had been looking for something to document and therefore found it, that the encounter might have resolved itself differently if she hadn't been what she was. Aya listened to the question and then said the encounter would have resolved differently if the officers had followed the law. That's the only variable that would have changed the outcome. The attorney tried two more approaches, neither of them found traction. She had the particular quality of a witness whose is nothing to protect, whose is not managing an image or protecting a narrative, who is simply describing what happened, because what happened is what matters, and that quality is extremely difficult to cross-examine effectively. She stepped down and walked back through the courtroom and out through the side door into the corridor, and she stood there for a moment with her back against the wall and let herself be tired. Was in the corridor, leaning against the opposite wall with a cup of coffee. She apparently had no intention of drinking. Okay. Yeah, Mara said. Yeah, I'm okay. This came in on a Thursday, 11 days after the trial began. Hatch, guilty on all 5 counts: conspiracy, obstruction, abuse of office, civil rights violation, and abetting unlawful detention. Warren Gould, guilty on 2 counts under the cooperation agreement, obstruction and conspiracy. Braddock, guilty on 4 counts, including the gas station charges, and 2 additional civil rights violations established through his own records. Cooperation agreement reduced his sentencing exposure, but did not remove the convictions. Guilty on 3 counts. Doss, guilty on 2 counts. He had eventually spoken with investigators at the strong recommendation of his public defender approximately 2 weeks before trial. Butler, the officer at the hospital, guilty on the obstruction and tampering charges. Hatch received 14 years in federal prison. His face when the verdict was read did not show the things Mara had expected, not outrage, not disbelief. He looked tired and diminished, and older than he had looked in the photograph from the county website that the news channels had been running. He looked, she thought, like a man who had finally run into the limit of his own protection and found out that the limit was real. Received 30 months under the cooperation agreement. Braddock received 9 years. When the sentence was handed down, he looked at the table in front of him and did not look up. The sentencing for the remaining officers happened in a separate session 2 weeks later. Received 4 years. Doss received 2.5. Cutler received 18 months. All of them lost their law enforcement certifications permanently. Harlow County Sheriff's Department was placed under a federal consent decree requiring independent oversight, mandatory body camera compliance, external review of all complaints, and a restructured chain of command that removed any administrative connection to the commissioner's office. An interim oversight board was established, composed of residents with no prior connection to the department or county administrative structure, a requirement that took 3 months to satisfy fully, because finding people in a county that size who had no connection to the existing system turned out to be harder than anticipated, which was itself a data point about how deeply the structure had been embedded. The consent decree ran for 5 years with annual reviews. It was not a perfect system. No system that had failed as comprehensively as this one could be replaced overnight with something that worked flawlessly. The first year had problems, gaps in the body camera protocol, 2 complaints that were initially misrouted, a training deficit that required a supplemental grant to address. These things were documented, they were reviewed, they were corrected in the subsequent year's report. This was the difference, not perfection. Just accountability that moved in one direction instead of dissolving into paperwork. Alvin Terrell's unlawful detention was formally vacated from the county record. The letter was sent to Sandra Terrell from the U.S. Attorney's Office, acknowledging the harm caused by the 2021 detention and the subsequent retaliation against her family. It was a formal letter measured, just carefully worded. She read it at the kitchen table of her apartment in a city, she'd moved to after the trial, and she folded it and put it in the drawer where she kept the things she needed to know were still there. She called Mara that evening. I got the letter, she said. I heard it was coming, Mara said. It's strange, Sandra said. I thought I expected it to feel like more like a door closing. Was it a pause? It feels like a window opening, Sandra said. Which is different. A door closing is an ending. A window is you can breathe through it. That's different. Mara held the phone and didn't say anything for a moment. He deserved better than what happened to him, Mara said. Yes, Sandra said he did a breath, but at least now it's on the record. What happened to him is on the official record now. It's not nothing. No, Mara said, it's not nothing. Lies. Mara's undercover assignment ended formally 2 weeks after the trial in a document that was filed, countersigned, and archived in the task force record. At her field entity, the traveling nurse, the rotation placements, the carefully managed parallel life, was closed out through a process that took less time than it had taken to build it. 14 months of infrastructure, compressed into a week of paperwork. She found this mildly absurd, which was how she dealt with most things she couldn't change. She went back to Devlin County General for her last week of the rotation, not because she was required to, but because she had told Petra she would, and she didn't break commitments to people who had put cardboard sandwiches on the nurse's station counter and told her to eat. Petra received her return with a look that communicated everything she wasn't going to say, and then immediately handed her a chart for a patient in Bay 2. Less pain. Petra said different one this time. Coffee thinks it's stress. Is it stress? Possibly. But his EKG looks like stress that is being assisted by several other things. He also hasn't eaten today, which I found out when he told me it was his 3rd cup of coffee. I'll go, Mara said. And the week moved the way the work always moved, which was in its own rhythm, indifferent to what had been happening around it. She treated what came through the door. She handed off cleanly at the end of each shift. She thanked the department on her last day in the way she always thanked departments, directly, briefly, making it larger than it was. And she drove away from the parking lot. She had sat in for 20 minutes every morning for 6 weeks and did not look in the rearview mirror. Not because she was avoiding something, but because there was nothing behind her that needed watching anymore. The task force offered her a permanent field position 3 months after the trial. She sat with the offer for a week, not because she was uncertain. She knew what she wanted. She'd known it in the approximate way for a while, and in the specific way since the trial, but because she had learned somewhere between the Army and the FBI and the hospital wards, decisions made in the first week after something major are not always the right ones. You need the dust to settle. You need to know what the ground looks like when it's not moving. Ground settled. She turned down the permanent field position. She accepted instead an appointment as a federal training consultant for law enforcement oversight programs, a role that had been created partly in response to the Harlow County case, and that involved working with both law enforcement agencies and civilian oversight to build systems that were, as the program documentation described it, structurally resistant to institutional capture, which was a phrase that meant systems designed, so that when a Braddock or a Hatch emerged, the complaints had somewhere to go that wasn't controlled by the people the complaints were about. Clients. She kept her nursing license active. She negotiated this as a condition of the appointment, which the program office initially found unusual, and then accepted when she explained that her clinical background was directly relevant to her work in medical facility oversight and emergency response protocols. This was true and also not entirely the reason. The real reason was simpler. She was good at nursing in a way that she had come to understand was not separate from the rest of who she was. It was the same quality, the capacity to be fully present in a situation that required both technical precision and human attention, simultaneously, just applied in a different room. She wasn't ready to give that up. She might never be. She told Elise this during a phone call in November, driving back from her first training session in a county 3 hours north, the radio off and the highway empty in the early evening dark. That makes sense, Elise said. You've always needed both. No, Mara said. Most people pick one thing, Elise said. You were always going to be difficult about it. Is that a criticism? Oh, Elise said, it's just a fact. They talked for 40 minutes, which was longer than their usual calls, and about half as long as the calls had been when they were younger, before their respective careers had made them good at being efficient with each other. They talked about their mother who had received a clean scan at her last appointment and who had responded to the news by immediately booking a trip she had been putting off for years. They talked about the Terrell Consent Decree's first annual review, which Elise had been involved in and which she described as imperfect and necessary and better than what was there before, which was nothing. They talked about Petra, who had apparently been cited in a regional healthcare association newsletter for her department management during a staffing crisis, and who had sent Mara a text about it that read, "They made me sound competent in print. Thought you'd find that funny." "Are you okay?" Elise asked eventually. Not the crisis version of the question, an ordinary version, asked by a sister who wanted an honest answer. Mara thought about it honestly, which she had learned was the only way worth doing. She said, "I think I actually am. That's different," Elise said. "Fine." "No," Mara said. "It's weird mostly," Marissa said. "Ask me again in a few months." She went to Crestfield at Thanksgiving. The drive down was different from the August drive. The trees had changed and the light had the particular low angle of late November. Everything golden and slightly tired, the landscape going through its annual process of letting things go. She didn't stop at any gas station on the highway. She filled up before she left and made it the whole way without stopping, which she had specifically decided to do. The house on Alderman Street had a new screen door, installed by a neighbor who had apparently taken the project on as a personal mission after hearing that Nadine's daughter had mentioned the old one was broken. Aya stood on the porch and looked at it for a moment, running her thumb along the new latch, which was tight and clean and properly aligned. Ice was already inside. She'd driven up the day before and had apparently spent most of it reorganizing the kitchen in a way that Nadine had opinions about, and they were still working through those opinions when Mara came in. "The spices were in alphabetical order," Elise said. "Alphabetical is not how you cook," Nadine said. "It's how you find things." "I know where everything is." "You put the cumin next to the cornstarch." "I use them around the same time of year." Mara set her bag down by the door and listened to this for approximately 30 seconds, and then went to the kitchen and made coffee, because the coffee was something she could do without entering the spice debate. Nadine found her there a few minutes later. She looked better than she had in August, not completely better. Not the way she'd looked before the diagnosis, but the particular kind of better that accumulates slowly and is more durable than the fast kind. She moved with less care. She'd put on weight in the way the doctors had been hoping for. Her hair was fully back, darker than it had been before. She looked at Mara in the way she had looked at her since the day Mara came home from her first deployment, and something had shifted in her face that Nadine had clocked immediately and never mentioned aloud. "You seem different," Nadine said. "I'm tired," Mara said. "Not that kind of different." Nadine poured herself a cup without being asked. "Yes. Like you're waiting for something." Mara considered this. She looked at the window above the sink, at the street outside where Miss Dante's car was parked, and two kids were moving through the yard across the way doing something with a length of rope that didn't look supervised. "I probably was waiting," Mara said, "for a while." "For what?" "I'm not sure exactly. For things to be resolved, I think. How they came out. And now you know more than I did." Nadine wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the window, too. "When you were small," she said, "you used to fix things even when nobody asked you to. Others' tools would come out, and I'd find you in the garage or on the porch or under the sink." "I never knew where you learned it." "I didn't learn it anywhere," Mara said. "I just didn't like things being broken." "No," Nadine said. "You never did." They stood in the kitchen while the coffee finished, and the street outside did what streets do in the late morning of a holiday, slowly filling with the particular quality of people who have temporarily suspended the usual pace of things and are moving through the day in a different register. Reached up and unclasped the silver pendant, something she had not done in a long time. She held it in her palm. It was small and remarkable, just a flat oval of silver, with a simple engraved pattern on the face, and on the reverse the recess tab that had started a chain of events in a Georgia gas station in August. You wouldn't know it from looking at it. Her mother looked at it. Right. You're not wearing it today, Nadine said. I thought I might, Mara said. But today doesn't need it. Right. She put it on the counter by the window in the patch of November light, and it sat there quietly while they drank their coffee. And Elise continued her argument about spices from the other room, and the street outside moved in its ordinary way. There was something Mara had been working out for a long time, that she got clearer on in the months that followed, not all the way clear, not the kind of clarity that feels finished, but the kind that feels livable. She had spent years being the person that institutions underestimated, not always dramatically, not always with malice. Sometimes it was the army evaluator who saw a woman where the role description implied something else. Sometimes it was a hospital administrator who read traveling nurse as provisional as someone passing through, as not worth the investment of being taken seriously. Sometimes it was a county sergeant who looked at two women at a gas pump and decided they were the kind of people who didn't need their rights honored. The pattern was so consistent, it was almost boring. Almost. What she had learned, what the pendant on the counter in the November light represented, in the way that objects sometimes represent things without being asked to, was that the underestimation was never actually the problem. It was a condition, something you operated in, like weather. The problem was what you chose to do inside it. Some people fought it immediately, loudly in the moment. She understood that impulse. She had felt it herself on more than one occasion. Fighting the underestimation directly meant engaging on someone else's terms in a frame they had set at a time they had chosen. And that in her experience was how you won the moment and lost everything around it. The other way, the harder way, the one that required a kind of patience that didn't come naturally to anyone, was to let them believe what they believed, right up until the moment the record was complete. Let them talk. Let them threaten. Let them make every decision they were going to make, fully on camera with everything running. And then let the evidence speak in the language that couldn't be form, lettered into nothing. That was what she tried to teach in the training sessions and the oversight workshops and the long conversations with civilian board members who were trying to figure out how to build systems that didn't get captured by the people they were supposed to oversee. She didn't teach it as a personal philosophy. She taught it as a structural principle because it worked better when it wasn't personal. But it was personal, she knew that. It had been personal since the first time. Someone in a position of authority had decided she was less than she was, and she had filed away and kept moving and kept doing the work and waited for the moment when the work spoke for itself. The work had spoken in Harlow County's federal record, in the consent decree, that required accountability to move in one direction instead of dissolving. In the 31 complaints that were now attached to a case that would be cited in law school classrooms and training programs for years. In Calvin Terrell's name, this entered into public record. It no longer a form letter, no longer nothing. Spoken, and it was still speaking in the training sessions and the oversight process and the slow, imperfect process of building something that worked better than what was there before. This was the thing she had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting for it. Not a moment of triumph. Not a scene that looked the way justice looks in a film, clean and bright and final. Just the ongoing, imperfect, necessary work of holding systems accountable to the people they were built to serve. The work that had to be done by people who were willing to do it without the assurance of applause. She picked up the pendant from the counter, clasped it back around her neck, because today needed it, because she had decided it was hers to wear, not because it concealed anything anymore, but because of what it had taken to stand in that parking lot and wait, and what waiting done right at the right moment, with the right preparation behind it, had been worth in the end. Elise appeared in the kitchen doorway. Mom wants to eat before noon, which apparently requires both of us to stop philosophizing and deal with the cornbread. I'm not philosophizing, Mara said. I'm standing here. That look on your face. What look? The one you get when you figured something out and you're deciding whether to say it. Ada looked at her sister. Then she picked up her coffee cup and moved toward the door. Bread, she said. Finally, Elise said, they went to help their mother in the house with the new screen door and the uneven driveway and the street outside going about its ordinary Thursday. and the pendant rested against Mara's collarbone, warm from her skin, saying nothing, carrying no secrets, meaning only what she decided it meant, which was that she had been in the room when it mattered. She had done the thing that needed doing, and she was still standing. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough.